Since Brexit, the UK has seen a staggering loss of over £100 billion in annual trade. To add to the turmoil, 7,000 financial jobs have quietly vanished. Compounding the dilemma, startling new reports reveal that 59% of young Britons are yearning a return to the EU fold. Former adversaries are now cautiously hinting at the rekindling of partnerships, sparking a provocative question. Can the UK and the EU mend their broken bond? Can they restore the trust that has been so thoroughly shattered, or is it truly beyond salvation? Intrigued by the roots of this tumultuous saga? Well, let's dive deep into the unfolding story. It's no longer news that the United Kingdom officially left the European Union on January 31st, 2020. However, for many across the continent, the real separation began the morning after the 2016 referendum on June 24th, when the Leave victory shocked global markets and split the British public in half. All across Europe, political leaders scrambled to understand the reality of losing one of the EU's largest economies. Indeed, the years that followed weren't as smooth as expected. So when the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement was finally signed on December 24th, 2020, it was presented as a resolution, but in truth it was only a beginning. The TCA may have prevented a no-deal crash, but it failed to build trust. As the Brexit dust settled in 2021, it became clear that this wasn't just a technical agreement, but a cold, formal divorce paper from the EU. The immediate economic aftermath was brutal. Reports from the Office for National Statistics showed that UK exports to the European Union fell by 40.7% in January 2021. Smaller businesses, especially those dealing with perishable goods, were hit the hardest as British exporters saw their entire shipments blocked under the new EU import rules. In politics, EU leaders were equally frustrated by the UK's handling of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was part of the Brexit deal meant to prevent a hard border on the island of Ireland. By 2022, the UK government, led by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, threatened to unilaterally override parts of the agreement. So this wasn't just politics as usual, as diplomats on both sides described the period between 2021 and 2023 as one of the coldest stretches in the relationship between the UK and the EU. Emotionally, the EU felt betrayed, and the UK in many ways felt defensive. The narrative in Britain was still centered around sovereignty and control, while the EU focused on unity and rules. These were two completely different languages, and for a few more years, neither side tried to be the bigger person. However, behind all this was a more profound, quieter shift in psychological trust. Could Britain be relied on? Would future leaders flip policies again? Or was Brexit just the start of an unpredictable UK foreign stance? This fear was also echoed in Brussels, but back in London there was growing bitterness over how the EU had treated the UK since the exit, with some feeling that the bloc had been intentionally rigid and punitive to Britain. However, by 2023, the tone shifted slightly as Britain's Conservative Party sank in the polls and public patience with the Brexit deal promises were running low. British citizens began to make demands, not necessarily to rejoin the Union, but to have greater stability. Back in the EU, leaders like Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz also began to signal a more open stance toward the possibility of future cooperation. So the question was no longer whether both economic powerhouses could do business again, it's now whether they can learn to trust each other. But then a new Prime Minister stepped into this silence with a new tone taking shape through him. When Keir Starmer was elected by a majority vote to become the UK's Prime Minister in July 2024, many wondered if the country's foreign policy might finally take a less offensive tone. Starmer, a former human rights lawyer and leader of the Labour Party since 2020, had long been seen as a more cautious, diplomatic and measured personality compared to his predecessors from the Conservative Party. However, what set Starmer apart was his subtlety. In his first major foreign policy utterance in October 2024, Starmer clarified that the UK was not seeking to rejoin the EU. "No, I don't think this is going to happen. I've been really clear about not rejoining the EU, the single market, or the customs union, or allowing a return to freedom of movement." That line told EU leaders everything they needed to hear. Britain wasn't returning. His government soon began to repair some behind-the-scenes relationships that had gone bad since 2020. Several diplomatic meetings with European ambassadors resumed regularly as civil service liaisons reopened their lines of communication, which had been frozen for years. Since assuming office, Foreign Secretary David Lammy has held multiple meetings with his counterparts from Berlin, Paris, and Brussels. One of the most symbolic gestures came in April 2025 when the UK and the EU jointly drafted a pre-summit declaration to reaffirm their shared commitment to free and fair trade within the region. While the declaration hasn't yet been finalised, it sent a powerful message that both sides are preparing for a serious diplomatic reset. All eyes now turn to the May 19th London summit, which is expected to bring together EU Council President Charles Michel, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and Prime Minister Starmer of the United Kingdom. While it's not a treaty, this summit is expected to set the tone for the next phase of UK-EU relations. What makes this moment different is that Starmer isn't promising any miracles. He's simply offering something the EU values more than charm: predictability. And so far, it's working. However, some EU leaders remain cautious as the memory of past confrontations hasn't quite faded. Germany, in particular, is taking a wait-and-see approach. French officials have welcomed the new tone, yet remain skeptical about how much the UK is willing to align. There's also quiet concern about whether Starmer's position is politically stable enough to carry these diplomatic overtures in the long run. That's why his approach has been seen as one of measured diplomacy. However, the world is facing new geopolitical shifts, such as the continuous war in Ukraine, rising tensions in the Indo-Pacific energy disruptions, and tariff wars with the United States government. The pressure is mounting. If the UK and EU don't seek to rebuild strategic alignment soon enough, both parties could become weaker globally. So the stakes are clear, and Starmer seems to understand that. Now let's talk about dynamic alignment being whispered in both camps. The phrase dynamic alignment may sound technical, but behind those two words is a quiet but powerful idea that the UK and EU can move in the same direction without being tied together. This is about cooperation that adopts working together where it helps and doing it on purpose. The concept of a dynamic alignment started gaining serious attention in the latter part of 2023 when EU policymakers began discussing new models for engaging with non-member states. France and Germany jointly floated a multi-tiered EU model which allows countries like the UK to align closely on specific issues without taking on the full responsibilities of the membership. This approach opened a door, especially for the UK, but economic and diplomatic pressures to cooperate seemed to rise. However, what does dynamic alignment look like in practice? One of the clearest examples is the chemical industry. The EU operates under REACH, which stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization and Restriction of Chemicals, a strict regulatory framework governing chemical substance production and use. Before Brexit was finalised, companies in the UK adhered to the regulatory rules of REACH. After Brexit, the UK created its version called UK REACH, which largely mirrors the EU's version but requires duplicate registrations and more expensive processes. This duplication quickly became a nightmare for British businesses. According to the Chemical Industries Association, UK companies faced over £1 billion in costs to re-register substances that are already registered under the EU system. At the same time, many smaller firms simply stopped exporting to the EU altogether. In early 2024, Chancellor Rachel Reeves confirmed that Labour would seek a bespoke agreement with the EU to allow for regulatory recognition that would effectively align with the EU's chemical standards without joining the bloc or REACH itself. The same applies to healthcare regulations. British pharmaceutical companies have long complained about delays in medicine approvals and access since leaving the European Medicines Agency. In February 2025, the UK's Department of Health and the European Commission began technical talks about a potential streamlining agreement where approvals granted by one side could be fast-tracked or accepted by the other without much constraint. This wouldn't be a return to shared oversight, but it would speed up access to life-saving treatments and reduce providers' costs. Then there's the digital sector, where data protection is one of the most talked about areas of potential alignment. The EU's General Data Protection Regulation is the gold standard for privacy laws on the continent. After Brexit, the UK kept a version of it, also called the UK GDPR. However, divergence risks have been growing, especially after proposals to ease some rules under the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, which was introduced in 2020 and reworked in 2024. If the UK drifts too far from EU data standards, it could lose its data adequacy status, meaning EU businesses could be legally barred from sharing data with British firms. Labour ministers have continued to suggest that the UK maintain a flexible data alignment to avoid that outcome. However, talks are also underway to create a UK-EU digital trust framework, allowing the free flow of personal data while respecting domestic legal control. But here lies one of the key risks in having a dynamic alignment: legal instability. Unlike being a full member of the EU, which comes with some institutional guarantees, dynamic alignment is often built on memoranda of understanding, not legally binding treaties. This makes such partnerships fragile, especially if political winds should shift either in London or in Brussels. Still, the sectors that matter most, such as chemicals, health, data and environmental regulation, are all pushing both sides towards a practical cooperation. In the meantime, the world isn't waiting for the UK and EU to work out their differences as supply chains, digital ecosystems and research networks continue to move on. So for both sides, the question is no longer whether to align, but how much alignment can they afford to lose before everyone starts to feel the consequences. The answer may lie in something else: trade. Trade was supposed to be a strong pillar of the Brexit deal. The ability to dictate its global deal terms, set national tariffs, and escape much of the EU's regulatory net was sold as a path to new prosperity. However, for many exporters in Britain, the past 5 years since Brexit have felt like a slow squeeze. The UK exports to the EU, which account for around 42% of all British trade, immediately fell in early 2021. Although the numbers eventually rebounded, businesses faced permanent new hurdles such as customs declarations, VAT adjustments, and new product labelling requirements. One major issue was the lack of mutual recognition of qualifications. Before Brexit, an engineer or lawyer from the UK could work freely across the EU. Now such qualifications would have to be individually assessed and approved by each member state of the Union. In 2024, the UK's Labour Party pledged to negotiate sector-specific mutual recognition deals starting from architecture, engineering and finance. Another critical pain point has been the veterinary and agri-food trade. Since Brexit, British food exports to the EU have been treated as third-country imports, meaning that health certificates, veterinary checks and, in some cases, physical inspections would be carried out at the border. In April 2024, the UK began implementing new border checks for high-risk animal products, further complicating trade. The Federation of Small Businesses warned that delays and compliance costs drove many firms to stop exporting their goods. In response, Labour has proposed a veterinary agreement between the UK and the EU that will remove most checks for agreed-upon product categories. While the EU has such agreements with countries like New Zealand, it's unclear how far Brussels is willing to go with the UK. Still, discussions began in early 2025, with EU officials signalling their interest, especially given the bloc's struggles with food inflation and supply chain disruptions due to the war in Ukraine. But beyond food and services, the UK's tech and financial sectors have also struggled with market access since Brexit. The loss of EU passporting rights means that British banks and fintech companies now need licenses in individual countries to operate across other parts of Europe. This has led many firms to shift significant parts of their operations to cities such as Amsterdam, Dublin, and Frankfurt. According to a 2024 report by The Guardian, over 7,000 jobs have relocated from the UK to other parts of the EU since 2020. To move forward, both sides will need to rebuild not only their trade mechanisms, but also the political will to support them. And this isn't just about customs codes or certificates anymore. Can the UK and EU trust each other enough to start fixing what's broken without reigniting the old battles? And as that trust is tested, another issue quietly rises to the surface: shared security. For most of the post-Brexit years, security has been one of the quietest areas of UK-EU relations. Behind the scenes, two of Europe's strongest defence partners were barely speaking on matters of mutual protection. However, that's changing very fast. In April 2025, just weeks before the highly anticipated London summit, the UK and EU began drafting a formal security cooperation agreement. This proposal, led by Foreign Secretary David Lammy and EU High Representative Joseph Borrell, is designed to build a foundation of structured collaboration on defence, intelligence, sanctions, and foreign policy. Although the talks are still in early stages, the intent is clear. Both sides want to move past silence and towards strategy. One reason for this shift is geography, and another is urgency. The war in Ukraine, which is now in its third year since Russia's subtle invasion in February 2022, has continued to reshape Europe's security map in recent years. The United Kingdom has remained one of Ukraine's most vocal and committed supporters, providing over £13 billion in military aid as of January 2025. This includes advanced weapons, training for Ukrainian troops, and intelligence support. In many cases, the UK has acted even faster than some EU countries, which has earned it deep respect in Kiev and across parts of Eastern Europe. The EU too has responded strongly through coordinated sanctions against Russia, sending billions in aid to Ukraine and reinforcing its defence spending through the European Peace Facility. However, much of this work continues in parallel without a formal security mechanism to include the UK. According to early outlines of the UK-EU security proposal, shared in Brussels in early April, the framework would include monthly strategic briefings between senior UK and EU security officials, a joint task force on cyber defence, targeting election interference and digital infrastructure threats, and coordinated sanctions. The EU is especially keen on this deal because the UK brings serious military and intelligence capabilities. Britain remains one of Europe's two nuclear powers alongside France, and is also the second largest defence spender in NATO after the United States. Its government communications headquarters is one of the world's most advanced cyber agencies. Through the Five Eyes intelligence alliance with the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the UK retains its access to surveillance networks that no EU institution can match. From the EU's perspective, bringing the UK closer on security doesn't require membership and access. And from the UK's perspective, cooperating with the EU doesn't mean surrendering control, but rebuilding its influence in areas where Brussels still matters. Another flashpoint where such cooperation is already being tested is Gaza, which is far away in the Middle East. Since the outbreak of conflict in October 2023, following Hamas' large-scale attack and Israel's military response, the international community has been under pressure to call for a sustained ceasefire and humanitarian access in the area. UK and EU have both technically supported the idea of a two-state solution. The UK under Starmer has taken a more cautious approach, which emphasises Israel's right to self-defence, but also calls for an immediate humanitarian corridor and an end to civilian targeting. On the other hand, the EU has been more fractured, with Ireland and Spain pushing for stronger condemnation of Israel's actions. In contrast, other countries like Germany maintain their traditional support for Israeli security. And it's not just about war zones. Issues such as climate threats, energy disruptions, and migration crisis have all revealed a need to adopt a corporate strategy. Then there's the issue of cyber defense, where a growing threat that doesn't care about national borders seems to be rising. The 2024 European Parliament election saw a wave of attempts to spread disinformation campaigns, which many linked to Russian and Chinese networks. The UK's National Cybersecurity Centre flagged similar patterns during the same period, but without a direct channel for real-time alerts, both sides were forced to act independently. Yet for all the ambition, there are still limits, as intelligence sharing raises legal questions, especially around data protection. Defence procurement policies differ widely between the UK and the EU, and politically some EU member states worry that opening the door too wide might send the wrong signal about the consequences of Brexit. What's taking shape now isn't just a policy but a test. Can the security cooperation become the first step towards repairing a wider relationship? But within the UK government, political appetite for rejoining the EU remains divided. The Labour-led government clarified that the UK would not seek re-entry to the EU. Prime Minister Starmer has repeatedly said that the Brexit debate is over and that his government's job is to improve the current relationship, not to reverse it. However, beneath that surface, public opinion is evolving. Campaigns for a second referendum have not yet returned fully, but the sentiments are visible. Many Britons, especially younger generations and those in Scotland and Northern Ireland, are beginning to question what sovereignty without cooperation offers. Still, the political path to rejoining is blocked for now. That's why associate membership or dynamic alignment frameworks are gaining traction. They offer a way for the UK to work closely without political re-entry into the Union. However, this requires careful management because if the UK moves too close, it risks being seen as having all the obligations of membership without the influence. If it stays too distant, it risks more economic and diplomatic isolation. The May 19th London summit is expecting to be a pivotal moment for both parties. Available drafts of the summit agenda suggest joint announcements on trade facilitation, security coordination, and energy cooperation in light of Trump's economic moves since returning to the White House. While no treaty will be signed, this summit could shape the tone of UK-EU relations for the rest of the decade. Therefore, both sides stand at a delicate point as they must now answer a question neither could have imagined asking 10 years ago. How do you build a future together when your past still stands between you? Thank you for watching. What are your thoughts on the future of the UK-EU partnership? We'd love to hear from you. Remember to hit the like button and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.